Hello again, back for chapter 9 now. Chapter 9 is dealing with the development of the Western musical system, particularly tuning in that system. So the first part of the chapter is pretty math heavy, where we are talking about music intervals and pitch ratios and things like that, just in general. We're going to focus mostly on what you would tend to call the more pure music intervals, which will be octaves, perfect fifths, perfect fourths, and major thirds. There are many other intervals, as I'll show you in an example site that I shared with you on the Chapter 9 video page, where you can hear all these other intervals. I don't think that site has like the augmented and diminished intervals, but realistically, um, we really only care about those really pure intervals, which are the ones like if you're tuning by ear, those are the types of intervals you hear: octaves, fifths, fourths, and major thirds all sound very good to our ears naturally, and so it lends itself to tuning by ear, but there are some issues associated with that, as we'll see. So first few slides, a lot of math. This does show up in the chapter homework and on the test in a few places where not only do you need to know the frequency intervals, but you need to be able to, given one of the two notes in your interval, be able to calculate the other one. And there are a few examples in this chapter. I've made some small modifications to the slides to show that, so you have a little bit of time to uh, kind of work it out yourself, and then it'll show on the screen so that I'm not writing badly like I have in the last couple of videos. But you probably will want to work on that a little bit more, and especially have the slides up when you're working on the homework so you can figure that out, because it will show up on the test. After we get through just defining the intervals, we'll talk about how we tried to fit those intervals into Western tuning scales. We'll start with the predominant tuning back when we were talking about Greeks and Romans, which is the Pythagorean tuning. Then we'll go into just intonation, quarter comma mean tone. Those are all what we call open temperaments. Then we'll go into closed temperaments. First, unequal closed temperaments, which were kind of common in the 1700s, early 1800s, late 1600s, where especially as you started to develop the classical keyboard instruments and you wanted to be able to play a bunch of different tunes on one keyboard without having to retune it every time, the development of these closed unequal temperaments, which basically let you play in many different keys without retuning, kind of developed. And then we'll get to the modern day temperament, which is predominantly equal temperament. We're not going to touch the Eastern music, but Eastern music has a lot more tones that are kind of defined rather than the Western standard, uh, 12 semitones in your scale. Whereas Eastern music uses a lot of those intermediate tones that Western music kind of just throws out. So that's where we're going with this. It's a pretty short chapter overall. I have overall on the video page, other than the resource for hearing the intervals that I'm going to show you, I'm not going to play the intervals because I'm not sure how that will interact in the recording. I'll leave that to you to kind of play around with yourself so you can kind of get used to hearing the differences between them. I have probably two videos by one person who he discusses the development of the music temperaments like we're going to, in probably about a 10 to 15 minute video. And then there's a second video where he plays some of these intervals in the different temperaments so you can hear how they're different. Then there's another video on the differences basically between Pythagorean and quarter comma mean tone, where they show what's different about them and also how it relates to modern music. That one's pretty short. It's like 5 minutes, covers some of the same ground, so it's not super necessary. And then one that's playing a bunch of pieces in different temperaments, common pieces that you've heard. I think it's Mozart and Vivaldi. And then one last one where they show a closed unequal temperament, and especially I think it's particularly the Werkmeister temperament, in addition to showing kind of a more traditional mean tone temperament that was open, playing the same stuff in those different keys on a harpsichord, so you can kind of hear the difference there. So that's what the video resources at the bottom are. So I'll get into this now that I've basically covered the whole chapter in a nutshell. First of all, tuning. The major intervals that we care about, again, there are many more intervals that we're, if you get super into music theory, you can dive way into that, especially even more if you leave the Western scale behind altogether. The predominant one that we're always going to keep, no matter which temperament we talk about later, are octaves, where we have the same note in two different frequency ranges, have a 2-to-1 ratio always. So traditional tuning A in the modern world is 440 hertz. If you go up an octave, you go up to 880 hertz, you double the frequency. If you go down an octave, you cut that frequency in half from 440 to 220. So you'll see the increase is a factor of 2 every time. So going up 1 octave, 220 to 440, say, and then to the next octave would be 440 to 880. It's not the same frequency range numerically, but the interval is always fixed at 2-to-1. And we always want octaves as pure as possible, because it's very easy to hear those mistuned. They'll beat pretty obviously. And we always want our octaves to be in unison, which when we get into instruments in particular, not just the generic math description of what we're talking about here, that lends to some kind of quirks different instruments have, like a piano, the C on a piano at the very bottom and a C at the very top. If you actually listen to their fundamentals, they're not going to be in it, like on this exact 2-to-1 ratio thing, because of the inharmonicities in the strings. They actually make it so that the you basically want the inharmonicities to be in unison with the string up, rather than trying to tune exact 2-to-1s, because then you get the higher, not quite octaves sounding bad compared to the other keys. That's just one example. The other frequency intervals that we talk about in tuning are major thirds, which are a 4-to-5 ratio. So if you're going up, you're multiplying by 1.25. If you're going down, you're multiplying by 0.8. Perfect fourths, if you go up, you're multiplying by 1.3 repeating. If you go down, you're multiplying by 0.75. And perfect fifths are 1.5 if you're going up, and if you're going down, you're multiplying by 0.6 repeating. 2/3 basically. This would be 4/5, 3/4, 2/3, or 5/4, 4/3, 3/2 if you want to display it as fractions. So in a perfect world, once you tune, you have all these intervals exactly in place, but we'll see as we start talking about actual tuning scales rather than just frequency intervals, that we run into issues keeping all these straight. And eventually we have to make a compromise so that we can keep octaves and tune whichever interval we're most interested in as good as we can. And sometimes we tune several of them badly, and sometimes we tune some of them perfectly. And each key kind of has its own character. And it's basically developed for the type of music or the period of music that it's being played. So Greek and Roman stuff, we'll see they tried to tune all the fifths as perfectly as they could. Renaissance, when the quarter comma mean tone was developed, they tuned thirds as perfect as they could. Fourths never really factored that much into the whole tuning scale. They tend to fall pretty naturally close to a perfect fourth, no matter how you're tuning these, but fourths are always a little bit off because we typically focus on fifths and thirds. So a couple questions dealing with these frequency intervals. The first one, if we play a note at 500 hertz, if we want a perfect fifth, what frequency should that second note be played at? And we'll go the easy way and go up always, though I'll mention what it would be if you go down. So I'll give you a sec to kind of figure this out. If you go back to the previous slide, here are your frequency intervals. So 500 is your low note in the interval here. So if we look at this, what we'll have is 500 hertz is our low note, and for a perfect fifth, going up, our frequency interval is 1.5. So multiplying that together, we get 750 hertz. So 500 and 750, that gives you a perfect fifth. Doing the same thing, but now for a major third, with again the 1000 hertz that's given being the lower note. I can't go back now because of the animation. So if you remember, the major third frequency ratio was 5:4. So this one, 1000 times 5:4, which would be 1.25, gives us 1250 hertz. So you'll notice here that even though each of these were increasing the frequency by 250 hertz, in this case, it would be a fifth, and in this case, it would be a third, just because of where we're starting our frequency. We'll do these next two questions, and then I'll show you this resource for hearing all the intervals before we get into the actual temperaments. So here we have two notes already given. They tell us that our two notes are 600 hertz and 800 hertz, and we want to figure out the frequency interval. So if we're doing this, what we want to do is take the ratio of our two frequencies first and then see which one of them that lines up with. So this one, if we take 800 over 600, we get 4/3, which we see was a perfect fourth if we go back and look at our frequency intervals. And the last one is probably the easiest one. We have 125 and 250. What interval is this? Well, this is an exact 2-to-1 ratio, so that's going to be an octave. Musically, what you see denoted for these, a major third would be a capital M3, a perfect fourth would be a P4, a perfect fifth would be a P5. So these are the intervals we really care about other than octaves. Octaves are in there as well. Octaves are denoted as P8 because they're kind of interval-wise, they're an eighth. A unison note would be a first, but that's kind of boring. So an eighth would be an octave, and it's a 2-to-1 ratio, and it's perfect. Some other intervals, minor third, that's a lowercase m3, is a 6-to-5 ratio. A minor sixth is an 8-to-5 ratio. Major sixth is a 5-to-3 ratio. So let me exit out of this real quick. I'll come back to it in a sec. An interesting thing that I found because I had a video before that showed some of these um, different tones being played with a synth, and that video is gone now on YouTube. It's not there anymore. I found this intervals quiz, and what I recommend you do, I'm not going to pay for this, but what we have, if I click the advanced options like I just did, we have all these different options. What I would do is I would always play them harmonic, um, because that is what we're interested in. We're talking about particularly for the development of our tuning systems, notes being played at the same time. So the reason that Greeks liked fifths is they liked the way they sounded when you played a perfect fifth, both notes in the interval at the same time, or progressively. Um, for thirds in the Renaissance, they liked thirds. So you want to hear them together to kind of judge the difference between them. You can take the quiz. You don't really need to take the quiz. But if you click on the listen to intervals option here and go ahead and go to start quiz, you can just listen to the intervals by clicking next to this. And if you're interested in trying to be able to distinguish the difference, the options that are on there to begin with give you thirds, fifths, and octaves, which the reason they give you those are because those are the ones that predominantly are what we use to define our tuning scales. If you're interested in throwing the fourth in there and say going through the quiz, you can click on the fourth, that activates it. Or you can activate as many of them and see if you can tell the difference between them. When I was messing with this personally, once you add the fourth in, especially if you fix the root, that's the scale always begins on the same note, it's really pretty easy to tell the difference between all of these intervals, the perfect intervals, your fourth, fifth, and octave, and then the major third. With the root being able to move around, it's sometimes more difficult because you're limited by what you're listening on to a certain degree, especially for the very low notes. If you're using like your laptop speakers, they can't really play those really low notes very well. And so that gives you some weird effects that you probably, if you had a really nice system that you were doing this through, it would be easier to tell. Octaves are going to sound the best out of these. Fifths are fairly close to octaves in terms of how pure they sound. But what I kind of noticed listening to it, there's a little bit of beating, especially since I'm pretty sure they're just playing these on a piano. And so, or a synthesized piano. So that kind of has that little bit of stretch tuning to it so that the lower notes are not exactly an octave or exactly a perfect fifth. We're talking an equal tempered instrument. And so octaves are going to sound the purest, where you have the two lining up perfectly. Fifths, there's a little bit of beating in there, but it's not that bad. Thirds are typically where it's easiest to pick up the beating. That's kind of the more dissonant. And then the perfect fourth is kind of it's also very pure sounding, like the fifth is. The third is typically where you hear the biggest kind of, there's just, it still sounds good, but especially at the beginning of notes, there'll just be a little bit of harshness to it. And it's a little bit easier to distinguish, in my opinion, the third and the octave, but everyone hears a little bit differently. So this is a good resource. Clicking on some of these, you can hear how they sound. And again, we're most interested in major third, perfect fifth, and octaves when we're talking about developing tuning scales. But the ratios you need to be able to deal with on the homework and the test are major thirds, perfect fourths, perfect fifths, and octaves. And that link, I haven't published this yet, but that's this first link here. Here's all the different instruments that I was talking about. These two will cover, this one covers a lot of the same ground that the lecture slides do. This just plays some examples of some tones and maybe some pieces I can't remember in different temperaments. This definitely has different temperaments, 4 different temperaments, 2 different pieces it plays. Like I said, I think it's Mozart and Vivaldi. Does Pythagorean, just intonation, quarter comma mean tone, and then equal tempered. And I'll mention when we get to this, playing this, this one, it's really easy to hear the tuning compromise they make for the quarter comma mean tone. Music that is not of that era really sounds bad in quarter comma mean tone, because we're typically enamored to hearing fifths. That's in the equal temperament, the fifth ends up being the closest to what it should be for fifths and thirds. So we're used to hearing pretty good quality fifths. And so to sacrifice the quality of the fifth to make the third better usually doesn't sound right to us. But if you were to play or like something modern in the Renaissance, if you had a time machine, they wouldn't like it because they're used to hearing thirds, and they would be not happy with the quality of the thirds. So these are more just general development of temperaments, which we're about to get into. This is specifically showing moving from an open temperament to a closed, unequal temperament, how that changes the quality of the music. Back into the presentation. Okay, so temperament. If we were to build a perfect musical range of tones in terms of Western music, we would tune all our fifths to a perfect 3-to-2 ratio, all thirds to a perfect 5-to-4 ratio, and all octaves to a 2-to-1 ratio. But it turns out mathematically this is impossible to do. We can't even tune, we always want to preserve octaves over every other interval. No matter which tuning system we're talking about, our octaves should always be 2-to-1. So even if we want to go into everything, every octave is the way it should be, and all fifths are a 3-to-2 ratio, what we'll see on the next slide, even that's impossible, let alone being able to tune every octave true and every fifth true. That will naturally just give us thirds that are going to be too sharp and sound bad. But we can't even do every octave and every fifth. That's just naturally not going to work out. Mathematically, it's impossible. And so what this means is if we want to preserve our perfect octaves, we're going to have to compromise somewhere in the fifths and the thirds and the fourths and all these other intervals to accommodate those octaves, and then also to make the rest of our music sound as good as possible. And there are kind of 2 ways to go about this, 2 approaches. One is with an open temperament, where not every fifth is going to be exactly the same ratio, or closed temperaments, where we do close the circle of fifths, so to speak, and there still may be some different ratios, but we preserve the ability to play every key. When we have an open temperament, we're naturally going to have some keys that sound better than others, and dealing with that is just the nature of the beast. So the compromise we make in tuning is what we actually call the temperament. So this slide, you don't need to worry so much about the numbers. I'll walk you through what's going on here. So the bottom of this slide starts with a, well, can't really see it because the slide thing is in the way. But there's a note down here, which is D1 flat or C sharp, if you want to call it that way. And ideally, D flat and C sharp are the same thing. On a piano key, they're both the same key. And in modern equal temperament, they're both the same note. But when we're building a scale, depending on how we do it, we can actually get some difference between these tones. So if we start with a D flat in the bottom and we go up an octave, we double our frequency. That's 2. We go up another octave, we double that frequency, which is 4. Then we get to 8, 16, 32, 64, and 128 up here for this D flat that we've gone up 7 octaves. Now, the reason that they went up 7 octaves is because if I want to go from D flat to ideally D flat again by jumping up in fifths, that is going to go up 12, and that's going to get me close to 7 octaves. Not exactly, as you can see if you go ahead and look at the number here. This number and this number are not the same. And if they were the same, then this C sharp here and this D flat would be exactly the same note. But they're not if we go in the classic system of tuning every fifth true. So starting with the same bass note, going up a fifth takes me from D flat to A flat. Another fifth goes from A flat to E flat to B flat to F, F to C, C to G, G to D. So D and D flat are not the same note, of course. Then D to A, and you'll notice here C, G, D, A. That those are the strings of a viola or a cello. So these are all tuned in fifths. And then A to E, that's violin, would go G to E. So again, those strings are all fifths. E to B, B to F sharp, and then F sharp to C sharp. Now, again, I said beginning, C sharp and D flat are the same note on the modern scale, but here, going by fifths, if I'm start here, I go up by 1.5, and then I go up by another 1.5 and another 1.5. So I multiply by 1.5 12 times, and that number comes out to be this 129.75. Well, what this means is this C sharp up here is actually higher than the D flat. And what that would lend to is I can't have every one of these fifths be exactly 1.5, or D flat and C sharp, which have to be are supposed to be the same note, aren't the same note. And so in this, we have to make a judgment call somewhere where the fifth is not going to line up exactly to be 1.5. We can spread it out over the entirety of the scale, which is what we do in the modern equal temperament, or we can shove it all into one particular fifth and mistune that fifth so that we have basically 3 halves times to the 11th power, then times whatever number we need to get this to be equal to 128. And that's what the Greeks did. They decided we're just going to shove all this mistuning in one particular interval that we don't play very often, and then we will almost never hear it. And that's the basis of the Pythagorean scale, the Pythagorean temperament. So when we are building scales, we have 12 half steps in every octave in the modern Western scale. So a C major scale, if you play this on a piano, it's just going up on the white keys, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So C to D is a whole step. You go past a black key to get to the white key. D to E is a whole step. You go past another black key. Then E to F is a half step. F to G is a whole step. G to A is a whole step. A to B is a whole step. And then B to C is a half step. So 12 half steps, it's 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, 12 half steps. G major scale, same construction in going up key-wise. The difference here is just what your intervals end up being: G to A, A to B. You have this E to F sharp now. That's a half step. Or sorry, that's a whole step instead of the half step we have going from E to F here. If you maintain major scales, this is always whole step, half step, whole step, half step. The frequency intervals, the frequency increase numerically is going to vary depending on what your bass note is and what your temperament is. So if you're playing a C major scale in the Pythagorean temperament, it's going to sound one way. If you play it in the quarter comma mean tone temperament, it's going to sound another way. And if you start on a different C, those frequency increases are also going to change. But here they're particularly referencing the frequency intervals going through the scale will vary depending on how we temper our tuning. So something that's going to be key to discussing this is the circle of fifths. The circle of fifths, if you notice, let's go ahead and start with that D flat C sharp that we had over there. If we were to go back to that slide here, you'll notice that as we go up a fifth, we're moving around this way. And if we were to go down fifths, we would be going back this way. So going up a fifth, we would be going around this way. And notes that are very close to one another on the circle of fifths, whether you're going either this way or this way, sound very similar. And they don't, when you tune the fifths well, these are all going to sound very good. Tuning a instrument to the key of C, major key of C, and then playing a tune that is a tune of G, it's going to sound pretty decent, a G major tune. If you tune your instrument to a C major scale, and then you try to play something in F sharp major, well, that's going to sound really bad if your temperament is not closed. So when we're talking about a closed temperament, the circle of fifths has been closed and every key is somewhat playable. So on a modern instrument, we don't really tune to a particular key. We tune to the equal temperament, so you can play stuff in C, you can play stuff in F sharp, you can play stuff in D sharp. They all sound pretty much the same. In the olden days, when you're talking about things that weren't instruments that weren't designed for an equal temperament, what would happen is if you have your lute, ancient lute, and you tune it to C, and then someone asks you to play something that's in the key of B, you would basically have to retune or it would sound really bad. And so stuff that is very similar harmonically is going to end up not requiring a retuning. Stuff that's harmonically distant on the opposite side of the circle of fifths is going to require you to retune, basically. So we'll start by classifying our temperaments. This is where it would probably be good, maybe after a few of these slides, to pick up a couple of those videos on the video page and also supplement what I'm saying, because I might misspeak a little bit. This is not particularly my area of expertise. I have a little bit of music theory training, but not a ton. And so what you end up with here, I might accidentally misspeak, but those resources are very good. So we'll start by discussing the Pythagorean temperament. In the Pythagorean temperament, fifths are tuned perfectly to the detriment of other intervals. Octaves are always perfect. When they say almost here, the reason that this is almost, we'll see, is because of this difference in those frequency ratios here, one of these can't be tuned perfectly, at least one, but typically for the Pythagorean temperament, is just one of them is tuned badly. And then that fixes the octave and fifth problem. Open temperaments, we have some keys heavily favored over others. So the Pythagorean temperament is also still an open temperament. It's kind of separated out because it's kind of a special case. But open temperaments, some keys are heavily favored, so harmonically distant keys sound really bad. When we talk about open temperaments in the slides, we'll specifically be referring to the just temperament and the quarter comma mean tone temperaments. These have slightly different focuses. The just temperament really is tuned to one particular key, basically to the detriment of all others. And then the quarter comma mean tone tunes thirds really well, while not worrying about what happens to any of the other intervals. And so they sound a little bit different. The just temperament is what your ears would naturally tend to if you're just tuning completely by ear. So if you are tuning a guitar and you don't have access to a tuner and you're just tuning completely by ear, naturally you're probably going to end up in a just temperament for exactly whatever key you're playing. Though the nature of a fretted guitar is that it's naturally kind of developed for equal temperament, so it's not really going to matter that much. But tuning by ear will lend yourself to a just temperament. And then we'll close off by talking about closed temperaments. All keys sound okay, although some may still sound better than others. In a closed temperament, every key is playable. Now, the modern equal temperament is the paragon of closed temperaments. Every key is equally playable in the equal temperament. But there was a period of time, probably late 1700s, early 1800s, where different people fixed the issues with open temperaments basically by trial and error. And so there were still some keys that sounded better than others, because if most of the pieces that you're playing are, say, in D major, well, you make sure D major sounds the best, but you also will kind of make sure that other keys are playable to some degree, especially if you're dealing with something complicated like a piano where you don't want to retune it every time someone comes in to play a new piece on it. So you tune it well for pretty much everything, possibly better for some keys than others if more pieces are in certain keys, but you don't want to make it to where you basically have to retune every time someone's going to play a different piece. And so that was the development of the closed temperament. So the Pythagorean temperament, we're going to tune all of our fifths true except one. In this particular case, they are talking about, on this scale, they say the A sharp, which would be the B flat, to, sorry, let me going the wrong way. C sharp to A flat. So coming back here, C sharp to A flat, this very first interval actually, say, is mistuned slightly. And that is to preserve the octaves at 2-to-1 for everything. So if we did tune all fifths perfectly, D flat all the way up to C sharp, like on that scale, we would get this 129.75 number. Whereas octaves going from D flat up to D flat would give us 128. And so this little frequency ratio, where it's just like 1.34, 1.36% off, is that little bit of mistuning is basically what prevents us from tuning every fifth true, because you wouldn't want to play this D flat and this C sharp in unison because it wouldn't sound right. And so what we do is we offload this little bit of mistuning into 1/5. We tune that particular fifth a little bit flat. And what that does is makes it so that our octaves all stay true, but we have this one particular fifth that's a little bit off. And this would be called a wolf fifth because it just doesn't sound quite right. If you play that wolf fifth, it stands out in relation to all the others. There's a little bit more grating and beating to it. And because we're offloading it all into 1/5, it actually sounds really, really bad. It howls like a wolf when you play that particular fifth. Um, and we'll see this concept of a wolf fifth shows up as we move through temperaments over and over. It's kind of similar, but not quite the same as a wolf note on a cello. Wolf notes on a cello have to deal with resonance mismatches, but it's the same kind of idea where you have two different notes that should be the same, but they're not quite the same, and so it just really kind of sounds off when you look at this. So this is called the comma of Pythagoras. It has another name. I can't remember which one it is. There's the syntonic and the didactic comma, I think is what they're called. One of them has to deal with this slight mistuning from going up by fifths in relation to octaves, and the other one has to deal with how sharp the thirds sound when we tune all our fifths true. And this is referenced in that Renaissance tuning video. It's also referenced in the first history of temperaments. They may call it by the different name in there, but hopefully you don't really need to memorize that. So it's really not that vital. You just need to know that overall what a comma refers to in music is this little mistuning interval that shows up if we don't fix it with a temperament. So this slide has essentially how you get all the different notes in the Pythagorean scale starting at C and where they end up frequency ratio wise. You do not need to know this at all. The interesting things that we'll look at, going C to E, that should be a major third. And ideally, this would end up giving us 1.25 for that major third. But you'll notice this is actually 1.2656, which means we're sharp by quite a bit, actually. It ends up, you're talking about 0.0156. That's a fair amount of sharpness to the third. The fifth, C to G, is exactly true. The fourth, C to F, is pretty much dead on. And of course, the octave is fine. The interesting thing then lends itself to, if we were to look at one of the other fifths, let's look at, say, let's look at the fifth from E to A. If I take the ratio of, sorry, is that right? E to G. Well, check it. I think it's E. It's either E to A or E to B flat. I always forget my fifths, and I'm not going to page back through the circle of fifths to figure it out. So if I were to go from E to A, that's 1.6875 divided by that 1.2656. That's actually the fourth. So B flat would be the fifth. So 1.7778. That's probably 7 repeating, but that one comes out. Actually, I guess it's B, isn't it? Yeah, E to B. Like I said, my music theory is not always dead on. Have a little bit of training in it, but I'm not a musician. Well, not a musician anymore. So the fifth ends up pretty much dead on at 1.5. And the other thing is, if we look at some of these other intervals, they may end up true on some of them, but other ones are not exactly where they should be. Let's look at this C sharp to A flat fifth, though, right quick. 1.05802, and then dividing by 1.0679. Yeah, that is mistuned. If you put that in your calculator, you get 1.48 basically. So that that C sharp to A flat fifth is mistuned down just a little bit, basically so that we can fix the rest of the tuning in this scale. Again, our thirds don't end up exactly where they should, and it's just the compromise we make in this particular temperament. So Greeks and Romans pretty much played music in the Pythagorean temperament, and it was like that predominantly for a lot of the Middle Ages. But at some point, people, instead of just worrying about those intervals, they wanted to start playing chords. And with the Pythagorean temperament, if you're playing a chord uh, which has that that perfect fourth in there and the major third, the perfect fifth, um, that sounds all right. But if you notice, the three major chords are determined from your circle of fifths. You're going to end up with 1 to 1.25 to 1.5. Well, remember that 1.25 is actually a perfect or a major third. And so if you're trying to play a chord and you've got that major third that's pretty out of tune in there, it doesn't sound good. And so what the people that decided that they wanted to play chords started to do is they just decided to tune to whatever particular scale they were playing uh, that tune in, so that all the thirds in that scale were fine and all the fifths were fine, and they didn't worry about any other keys. If you were going to play something in the key of C, you make sure that the C to E here, that's exactly 1.25, and C to G is exactly 1.5. And everything that you would naturally play in the C major scale, C, D, E, G, A, B, and C, you make sure that's all uh, where you want it. And we don't care what happens to C sharp because we're not going to play it. We don't care what happens to F sharp because we're not going to play it. And so you tune the fifths and the thirds perfectly for just a small number of keys, basically C and anything very closely related to C on the circle of fifths. And then anything that's on the opposite side of the circle of fifths as a result sounds really bad. If you're doing a major chord, your tonic chord, that's the bass note. The dominant chord is the fifth up, and then the subdominant is actually the fourth. So C to F is a fourth in that particular chord. So the tonic, dominant, and subdominant major chords are tuned perfectly, which means chords on the opposite side of the circle of fifths are really bad sounding and useful if you're only going to play a few keys. So if you're going to play C, F, G, those all sound very close to one another and your instrument will be fine. But if you're playing something in C, you're tuned to C and you want to play something in F sharp, that major chord is really out of keys and it's not really that useful. This was kind of predominant also in the Renaissance, but I'd say probably a little bit earlier than the Renaissance, to be perfectly honest. Quarter comma mean tone was a little bit more prevalent because they worried about the thirds and not so much about the fifth. And as I mentioned, this is one that just naturally our ears gravitate towards because octaves sound good, perfect fifths sound good, perfect fourths sound good, major thirds sound good. These things all naturally are what we want to hear. And so tuning by ear completely will naturally lead us into a just temperament for that particular key that you're trying to play in, especially if you're dealing with a non-fretted instrument. So here for the just major scale, we'll look at the frequency intervals. Notice here where on the Pythagorean scale that was 1.26 something. Now we're at 1.25 exactly. We preserve this 1.5 exactly. Yeah, so that fixes the issue with the thirds being sharp like they were in the Pythagorean temperament and makes chords sound a bit better. Now, the mean tone temperament, this developed a little bit later, and this is still an open temperament. And this temperament, thirds are preferred at the expense of fifths. So when they're tuning, they're going to make sure this C to E interval is 1.25, but they don't care if the C to G interval is 1.5 anymore. And in fact, what they do is, skipping back here, they take this little bit of mistuning here that happens on the third naturally in the Pythagorean scale, and they split it into 4 and mistune all the fifths flat by that small amount, a quarter of this mismatch. That frequency mismatch between 1.25 for a major third and the 1.26 number for the Pythagorean third is the comma of didymus. Again, that has another name, and I can't remember if it's the syntonic comma or which one it is. So you take that mistuning, you split it into 4, and you tune all the fifths flat by that quarter of that mistuning. And so what this ends up doing is it makes the fifths flat from what you're used to hearing, but it makes sure that the thirds are tuned exactly. And it's just, again, a tuning compromise that you make basically because you want to hear thirds and you don't care if the fifths sound right. Now, this was kind of a phase. It went for a long time, fifths are what we care about. Then thirds became the rage, and then we're back to more fifths sounding good. But the equal temperament actually, neither the fifths nor the thirds are tuned exactly, we'll see. The fifths are closer. They're a little bit flat, but they're not as flat as they are here in the mean tone temperament. The thirds are still fairly sharp, but they're not as sharp as they are in the Pythagorean temperament. So the modern equal temperament compromises both the thirds and the fifths. Thirds more than fifths, but both are compromised. Mean tone temperament, thirds are good, fifths are bad. Pythagorean temperament, fifths are good, thirds are bad. And just temperament, everything's good, but only for a small handful of keys. So the upshot of our mean tone temperament, taking this mistuning, splitting it up onto fifths, is that our wolf fifths get really bad. It's really bad in the Pythagorean temperament, but now in this mean tone temperament, because we're mistuning the fifths even more, when you hit a wolf, it's really, really, really obvious. So we don't have a slide with the mean tone temperament here, but that's fine. Again, the numbers are not that vital. I'm just pointing out what they should be and what you end up with in some of these temperaments. So the next stage of development is the closed unequal temperaments. And whereas if you're talking about just temperament, everyone's pretty much talking about the same thing. Pythagorean temperament, everyone's talking about the same thing. Quarter comma mean tone, everybody's talking about the same thing. When we get to closed unequal temperaments, we run into an issue that these were all basically trial and error things. And so someone would come up with a closed unequal temperament that they liked, and then they would name it after themselves. So there are countless variations on these closed but unequal temperaments out there. This slide only references the Volati temperament and the Werkmeister temperament. But there are many, many more. I think the textbook has several of them, which I wish I could say for sure, but my textbook is at the closed campus, so I don't have it to look with me. I forgot to grab it before we shut down. So the upshot of a closed temperament is we close the circle of fifths in a way that we don't have any really obvious wolf fifths. There might still be some that are not great sounding, especially depending on which particular unequal temperament you're talking about, but none of them are so bad that they stand out really obviously in reference to the others. So if you tune your instrument to C in the Werkmeister temperament, if you tune your piano that way, you could play something in F sharp major and it would still sound acceptable. It still doesn't sound as good as if you were playing something in C, but it sounds okay. And this again was something that came about pretty much when modern keyboard instruments started to become more prevalent, because if you've ever tuned a piano, I personally haven't, but I've seen people do it, with 88 strings in a modern piano, it's a real pain to retune. So if you're going to tune your piano justly for C and then play something in F sharp, you have to retune all 88 strings or most of the 88 strings in the piano, and you don't want to do that. So what you would rather do is set it up in such a way that you can play almost anything on it. And the first development was to do this closed unequal temperament, where it was basically trial and error. They're like, okay, well, let's take this fifth and tweak it like this and tweak this one like this and play a bunch of stuff on it. Do I like the way it sounds? Yeah, maybe. If not, well, let me tweak this one some. And eventually they would settle on their frequency ratios that they're happy with. And again, because your fifths are all slightly different, some might be a little bit bigger than a true fifth, some might be a little bit less than a true fifth. Nothing sounds exactly right if you move outside of the key that the instrument is tuned to, but it sounds good enough that you can deal with it. So in the Volati temperament, the thirds and keys away from the tonic, so remember that's your bass note in a key, becomes sharper symmetrically. So you keep your thirds in the keys that you're playing pretty close, but you make the other thirds a little bit sharp, and this gives you fifths that still sound good, but they're not quite as good as they are in the Pythagorean temperament. But because you're only messing with the keys that are distant, you don't really develop any big wolf fifths. The Werkmeister temperament is the one that this video, which is also on the video page, I think it is an example of. This one has asymmetric key tuning, so you're not tuning every third exactly the same way. Some of them are mistuned more than others. It's a simpler tuning to do, and this is thought to be favored by Bach in particular. The tune, the Well-Tempered Clavier, was specifically kind of thought to be written for the Workmeister temperament. And it kind of fixed some, there's a lot of, I believe in that piece, there's a lot of moving between different keys for different phrases of the tune. And so it's basically to kind of highlight that every key is playable to some degree, but not exactly, none of them are exactly perfect. Now, again, closed versus open temperaments. Closed, every key is playable. Realistically, every key is playable in an open temperament too, but some are effectively unplayable because your intervals sound so bad that nobody wants to hear it. In a closed temperament, all your keys are at least passable sounding. In an open temperament, there's going to be one or more keys that are just so bad that there's no point in even trying to play that instrument without retuning it. So that's your big difference between closed and open. A closed temperament doesn't have to be equal temperament, which is what we're moving on to next. As we see here, there's asymmetric tuning, which means all these intervals will end up different. That's what the unequal means. Different frequency ratio, fifths, thirds, etc. As opposed to an equal temperament where every fifth, third, etc. is going to have the exact same ratios. So the modern equal temperament, we're going to be distributing our mistuning equally in all intervals. So we go back to that original setup that we had in the Pythagorean theorem, or the Pythagorean temperament, and we had that mistuning that we got when we went up in fifths. So what we do is we mistune each half step by 1/12 of that comma of Pythagoras. So that instead of the half step giving us exactly what we're looking for, everything's mistuned a little bit. And what we end up with are fifths that don't sound exactly right, thirds that still don't sound right. Octaves are still perfect. Again, octaves always end up perfect. But by mistuning each half step just the same amount, there's effectively no difference between the key of C and the key of F sharp. When everything's tuned the same way, it's going to sound the same in terms of frequency intervals. It's just you're starting with a different key, of course. So this particular one, they're showing what we end up with if we are dealing with harmonics. So a bass harmonic of 98 hertz, which I'm pretty sure is a C. So we start at C, we go up an octave. That is 2-to-1 exactly. That's great. The next harmonic frequency would be, I think, up a fifth from that, if I remember right. Then we hit the next octave, and I forget what all these ratios end up being at that point. This is 5-4, so that's a major third. Yeah, that's a perfect fifth there. So 5-4, that's a major third. 6-5, minor third, I think, something like that. Yeah. 7-6, 8-7, and so on and so on. This is going, here's an octave, here's an octave, here's an octave. And these are where the harmonics should lie. If we're tuning to our equal temperament, our octaves are still fine. Notice 98 to 196, 196 to 392, 392 to 784. Those are all fine. Here, going from 196 to 294, this third is, or sorry, this fifth is just slightly mistuned. We're off by like 0.3 hertz. So this would give us a really subtle difference. There'd be a little bit more beating here than this exact perfect fifth, but it's not off by that much. This one is a perfect fourth here, or sorry, this is a perfect fourth. This is just off of a perfect fourth. That interval's a little bit big there. 4 to 5, that's our major third. Here you can see this is very sharp. We're almost 4 hertz up on the major third there. And it's not as sharp as it would be if we were talking about Pythagorean temperament, but it's still pretty noticeable. So going back to our major chords, ideally it's 1 to 1.25 to 1.5. Every major chord in the equal temperament is going to have the exact same 1 to 1.26 to 1.4983 ratio. So C, E, G, that's going to have this ratio. F sharp, up a fifth and up a third and up a fifth. That's going to give us our same ratios for an F sharp. Whereas for an open temperament, a C, E, G, if you're tuned to C, and then you try to play the F sharp chord, those ratios are way different. In fact, so different that it typically sounds bad. So what this means is on an equal tempered instrument, every chord is going to sound kind of qualitatively the same. They all have the same character to them because the frequency ratios are all maintained. Fretted instruments, by the way, develop this equal temperament well in advance of keyboard instruments. And so when they started fretting instruments, guitars and their predecessors, they were already designing for equal temperaments early on. And so what this means is that this has been around for a long time, but it's really only been kind of commonplace to tune everything to equal temperament since sometime in the 1800s. And now in modern day, pretty much every instrument is equally tempered. But you can sometimes move to different temperaments, but it really depends on how the instrument is designed. Sometimes moving from an equal temperament to a just temperament basically requires you to redesign the instrument. And so modern instruments may not always be able to play period pieces exactly the same because of how they're designed, and vice versa. Technique can accomplish something to fix kind of problems that you have with older instruments. So on a violin, you put your fingers in a certain place to play certain notes. And if you were trying to play a different temperament, you would just slightly place your fingers differently to fix that. But if you have frets, you have to take out the frets and refret the whole thing to change the temperament of the instrument. So in our major chord, the one thing that ends up mattering is our fifth is a little flat. Our third, it's still sharp. It's not as sharp as it was. That was used to be like 1.265. So it's a little bit better, but it's still not great. It's still pretty noticeable when you play a major third that it's not dead on where it should be. And it's the compromise we've made. But if you cared about thirds, the equal temperament doesn't really do it for you because it actually is still preferring the fifth to the third. And it's probably why we tend to prefer fifths hearing-wise to thirds, because we're used to everything being composed in equal temperament, where the fifth is closer to true and the third is still pretty off. So this slide has a bunch of different scales and their frequency ratios, going up the C scale, showing every half step in between. You'll notice that here's our third in the just major scale, dead on. Mean tone, dead on. But if we look at our fifth here, we're mistuned just a little bit. Not nearly as bad as the third is mistuned, in the Pythagorean scale, but definitely off. So C, E, and G is really all I'm looking at here, because the octaves are all 2. E is the perfect, or the major third, and G is the perfect 5th. So if we come over to Werkmeister, our third is only slightly sharp. It's just barely sharp. Our G is actually slightly flatter than the mean tone scale, but C to G is still pretty close to true. It's just a little bit off, and it's probably not something that qualitatively you would hear very well. If I just pick another random 5th out that is not the A flat to C sharp one, so let's say, I don't know, let's go D, or sorry, let's go F sharp. F sharp to B flat. Is that right? No, that's not. F sharp to B flat would be the third. So if I pick F sharp to B flat here on the just major scale, 1.8 over 1.4063 is 1.28. So that third is really bad, even worse than this one. If I go F sharp to B in the mean tone, that should be dead on. Or sorry, F sharp to B flat, 1.3375. That's, sorry, F sharp to B flat, yeah. 7, 8, 8, 9, and it's still off. Oh yeah, because we're tuned to C. So that F sharp to B flat third is still pretty off. Here, F sharp to B flat, 1.778 and 1.4047 is 1.26. So it's about as mistuned as the third in the Pythagorean scale, which is sharp but not unplayable. And doing the same third there, 1.7818 and divide by 1.4142. That is 1.2599, which is the same 1.2599 we have between C and E here. So we're moving between these different scales. Here, a key that's very distant from C still has a big amount of mistuning in the thirds, because we're tuning the thirds here true. And if we end up with mistuning in thirds that are harmonically distant, well, we don't really care, because that's the key, not the key we're playing. Same idea here for the just scale. These 3 all being our open temperaments here. In our Werkmeister scale, this third is very good, and the F sharp to B flat third is about as good as the third is here. So we've improved the fact that these thirds going from F sharp to B flat here, that is pretty, very, very off. Going from F sharp to B flat here, it's about as good as this, and going from F sharp to B flat here is exactly the same as going from C to E. And so moving between these, we just are making different compromises. Here we want our fifths to be good except for 1/5. Here we want our thirds to be and fifths to be good, but only for one particular key or a small handful of keys. Here we want our thirds to be good for one particular key. Here we're talking fifths for one particular key as well. Here we're starting to make adjustments so everything sounds at least reasonable. And here we're just making this pure mathematically true so that every major third sounds pretty much identical. Every perfect fifth sounds pretty much identical. Whereas here, there's definitely some fluctuation depending on which key you're picking one of these out of. Same idea here. They're better pretty much everywhere, but there's still differences in certain fifths. And here, every fifth sounds the same. Every third sounds the same. Major third sounds the same, and minor thirds as well. You also notice one thing that is differentiated here. The D flat, well, they call it C sharp here. They don't even reference D flat. E flat and D sharp, these are all paired here because in this scale, Workmeister and Equal Temperament, you are playing these with one key on a keyboard. Here, D flat could be a different note depending on what tuning compromises you make. So again, lots of numbers. Don't really need to remember the numbers. Other than your octave being 2 to 1, your perfect fifth being 3 to 2, your perfect fourth being 4 to 3, and your major third being 5 to 4. Those are the numbers that matter. These other ones for different temperaments, you're not going to get asked what is the temperament or the frequency ratio of a major third in the Pythagorean scale. You're not going to see that. This is just to point out that is not true. This is true. This is true. This is a little bit off. This is more off, but not as bad as this. That's all these I'm showing you with these numbers. Open, different frequency ratios all the way through, and some keys sound better than others. Workmeister is a closed but unequal temperament, so every key sounds at least okay, but we have different frequency ratios. And then our equal temperament, all our frequency ratios are going to end up the same. Every fifth is the same. Every third is the same. Necessarily, that means it is a closed temperament. So you can have a closed unequal temperament and closed equal temperament. You can never have an open equal temperament. That's impossible. If you have an equal temperament, it has to be closed. So the last slide is dealing with pitch level. In the modern day, we tune to what we call concert A, which is A being 440 hertz, and then we tune everything relative to that A. So if you're tuning a violin or a viola, say, you tune your A, and then you tune your D off of the A. You make that perfect fifth as close as you can, and then you go D to G, tune that string, or A to E if you have a violin. So you're basically tuning all the fifths pretty close by ear. And if you're tuning into some sort of actual tuner, electronic tuner, it's going to tune exactly to the equal temperament. So your fifth would actually be a little bit off. Your D and A wouldn't sound just or perfect. They'd be a little bit different. But that's just the way it is. So past pitch levels were typically lower. Numbers you usually actually hear are 432, something like that. 432 hertz for the A lowers everything by a bit, and essentially it makes it easier for vocalists because the higher the pitches for a vocalist, the more strain you put on the muscles controlling your vocal cords and the vocal cords themselves, and it's pretty easy to damage your vocal cords, strain your voice. So operas and such, they may have been written with a lower A in mind, so that voice strain was not an issue. Transposing pitch down can cause problems for some instruments because there's a certain, say, bridge to nut distance. On a violin, something like that, you can make small adjustments to the position of the bridge to accommodate this. It might not radiate as effectively because of the position of the sound post and things like that, but it's not that difficult to readjust the position of a violin bridge. You just loosen the strings up to take all the tension off the bridge, wiggle it a little bit to change the position, and then tighten the strings back up. Now, but if you're dealing with something like a piano or a guitar where the bridge is not floating like it is in a violin, then you can't really change those distances without basically completely altering the instrument. You either have to unglue the nut or the bridge and move it and then reglue it down, which is not really effective. So you can tune your string down, but you might run into issues with things not really lining up exactly like you want them to tone wise. It's kind of hard to show it, but it makes sense that if you're designing with a certain pitch in mind, a trumpet's going to have a certain length. There's some flexibility in tuning slides and stuff, but if you're designing with a certain pitch in mind, the trumpet is as long as it is, and you can't add more length to it unless you've got a tuning slide. If you don't have a tuning slide, something like a bugle, which definitely doesn't have a tuning slide, you can't change the natural pitch of that thing because it is as long as it is, it's going to sound the way it's going to sound. So the actual pitch level is going to lend itself to certain instruments that are a little bit more flexible. If you want to change and play something a little bit lower, some instruments can handle it better than others. Other ones, you may not be able to do it without basically redesigning the instrument altogether. And so that is the end of this chapter. Off of this slide, you really just need to know that past pitch levels were lower. You don't need to know a particular number, but that they were lower. That's really all that, if I remember right, you need to know off of this slide. You don't even need to know that modern concert A is 440 hertz. But yeah, that's the end of this chapter. This is probably the most math-heavy chapter we've had in a while. But again, a lot of what I went through is not really that vital. The main ones are those frequency ratios for the kind of pure sounding intervals. That's important. Being able to figure out the other note in an interval, given one of the two notes, is important. But that's really about all you need to worry about for being able to do math for this chapter. You don't need to know how much thirds and fifths are off in different things. You just need to know the characteristics of those different temperaments, why they, what they did. So Pythagorean tunes fifths true, and thirds don't sound as great. Just intonation, everything sounds good for a handful, small set of keys. Quarter, comma, mean tone, thirds sound good for basically a subset of keys. If you go very different from the key you tune for, they sound bad for all three of those. Then you get to your closed temperaments, which are playable in every key to some degree. Unequal, some keys are still a little bit more playable than others. Equal temperament, every key is equally playable. And so that's typically why we are at equal temperament now, because we want to tune our piano once and forget about it, except to come back and fix it every once in a while when something goes out of tune. But we don't want to have to come in and retune between every performance if we don't have to. So it's kind of a convenience thing. It does lend itself to automation very well as in addition to that. But that's where we are. So again, the several videos on the video page are pretty much referencing the development of the temperaments as we go through eras. So starting with the Greeks to kind of Middle Ages, Renaissance kind of borderline, and then into our kind of Baroque period is where you kind of start getting the closed temperaments coming in, and then modern era clearly for our equal temperament. So that video will go through those, give you some different pieces so you can kind of hear how things sound differently when you make these tuning differences for the different temperaments. And then you've got the interval generator quiz thing, that so you can hear what the different intervals sound like. And so that's what's on that reference page. And this is not on the next test. This is on the last test other than the final. So the homework is not due for a while. I'm getting it up before the test, but it's not on this next test. This next test covers 4, 6, 7, and 8. 9 is after that. It will be on the test that comes with like woodwinds and brasses and I think stringed instruments other than pianos. So that's where we're going. I'll be working on the lab 8 video as well. That should be up soon if it's not already. And don't forget that your labs 1 through 6 are officially due no later than April 9th, which is the new test date for this second test. You can submit up to 6 and onward online, but anything earlier than lab 6, I'm going to ask you to email me directly. So take pictures or scan and email that to me, because a couple of those have graphs if you're missing them, and that just, it's hard. I don't want to be looking at that in the Canvas grading tools. So I do have all the paper labs that I have ever gotten graded. Grades are in Canvas. So that way you can see if you're missing anything before the deadline runs out on those. 7 and onward is not due until the end of the semester, which I don't know if they're going to add a week on for us. It doesn't seem like they're going to. So I think I have it set to the last Friday of the semester at this point, but that's over a month away. So you've got plenty of time on those if you haven't worked through those. And I still haven't decided what I'm going to do to supplement the in-class quizzes yet. I'm mulling over just cutting that completely and just giving everyone maybe just making the labs a little bit more predominant. I'm not sure yet, because I don't want to just give you another small quiz online. So I'm going to figure something out for that soon, hopefully. And that should be about all I have to say. So chapter 10 will probably get put up, at least part of it. I thought this one was longer than it is. Probably later in the week, because several of you probably will not look at this yet since it's not really pressing. And I think 10 is probably the longest set of slides that we have left, maybe 14 if we get to it all at all. So that's it. And I will get more materials up soon, and hope you all have a good day. As always, if you have questions, message me. I did kind of develop a survey. I'll probably try to put that up this week. I meant to get it up this week, but I've been working on lab stuff a bit, just to kind of gauge where you are tech-wise and what you might want, and see if you're kind of happy with how things are so far with this move to online. If there's anything that you would want to change. But some of it I may not be able to, but just to get some feedback would be good. All right, have a good day.